I'm delighted that we got three great speakers to discuss how we can ensure that the nation's recovery and nature's recovery go hand in hand. Hilary McGrady is Director General of the National Trust and has worked for the Trust since 2006, including as Director for Northern Ireland and then Director for Wales. Beccy Speight is Chief Executive of the RSPB, and before that headed up the Woodland Trust. And Tony Juniper has been Chair of Natural England since April 2019 and is a former Director of Advocacy and Campaigns at WOF and also a former Chief Executive at Friends of the Earth. They're eminently qualified to tackle these questions. Before I hand over to the panellists, a few bits of housekeeping and rules of engagement from me for all of the audience members. First of all, if you hover over your mouse to below where you can see my face right now, you should be able to see two buttons, one for Q&A and one for chat. The chat is where you can discuss among yourselves, respond to things panelists say, kind of generally hobnob with each other. And we've left the chat function open, but we won't be monitoring it. So if you want to put a question to the panelists, please use the Q&A function. You can pose questions either anonymously or, and I don't see why you do it anonymously, you can choose to reveal your identity. And once the questions have been asked, you can vote for your favorites by clicking the thumbs up button below the questions. My colleague Ruth Chambers will be collating the live questions as well as those that were sent in advance, and we'll try to cover as much ground as possible. I'm also being joined in the background by our events manager, Ollie Mount, who should be able to handle any technical glitches, including my Wi-Fi going down, and who has the awesome power to mute panelists who go on for too long. Finally, I should say we'll be issuing this event as a podcast in a couple of days' time. So do look out for the podcast on the Green Alliance's website or our Twitter feed. And you'll also, on the website, be able to see lots of other recent podcasts and Green Alliance blogs, including a blog from our first speaker, Hilary, based on a piece that Hilary wrote in the Daily Telegraph on Saturday. And Hilary, in that piece, you argued that the government's aim of improving the environment within a generation depends in large part on a partnership with conservation charities such as the National Trust. And I'd just like to ask you to kick off by saying something about how the current crisis is impacting on the National Trust's and other conservation charities' ability to help support the government on their nature and indeed their climate change agenda.
So thank you, Shaun, and hello to everyone that's joined us. Yes, so my piece of the weekend was really prompted very obviously in the first instance by the impact this is having on the National Trust. We made the statement that this year we estimate the impact will be in the region of 200 million, which is a huge number, a huge number for the National Trust to get its head around. And in response, we have clearly had to make some very tough decisions, not least pulling back on just about every project that we don't have to do. In other words, we're really focusing on only those things that are needed from a compliance point of view. And so it made me reflect on if this is the impact it's having on an organisation of my scale, and while we have good reserves and we're a big organisation and we will see this through, it was really evident to me that the sector itself is really suffering through this. Now, we would be the first to acknowledge that, of course, the country needs to think about health and people first, and it is right and proper that money and support is going to that sector. But what is really also very clear is that we must not come out of this crisis in a blind panic, concrete over all of the green work that we've been doing for these, whatever number of years, and really remember that actually all of the work that has been planned by government is largely dependent on our sector being in good shape at the end of this and able to do that work on their behalf. And lots of these small organisations and medium size are suffering, and they're all different. Some of them are a bit like us. They're membership based, or they've got a visitor business that they rely on that are clearly really suffering. But actually, even those that are more policy based, that are working the grants or fundraising, every one of those areas are either going to be challenged immediately, like us, or longer term. And I think that's a real challenge for us, because next year, actually, the landscape is likely to be even harder than the one we're facing this year. So even things like The fundraising environment we know is going to be really challenged. Legacies are likely to drop to we're estimating anything up to a third. So there are big areas that we know that are going to impact us short and medium and long term. So my ask of government and the public more broadly is to remember just how important the sector is to our renewal. And I think that's the thing that's most important to me here. This is about a renewed society, one that needs to have access to green space. If anything, if there's been a silver lining in this nightmare, it's been the reality that people need nature. They need access to green space. That's come through time and time and time again. And green space and nature, all of those things matter, and we need our sector to be in good shape to be able to deliver on that public benefit at the end. And we've made some very specific asks around grant support. I think my bigger concern is that long-term recovery package, because it is going to be a long-term impact that we're going to feel.
Thanks, Hilary. And just to follow up, I wonder if you think the message is getting through to government, and particularly the message that it's not just a sort of one-off hit, but that this will have a longer-term impact on membership and therefore on income, and that as delivery partners, conservation NGOs are just going to find it harder to be delivery partners unless the government kind of steps in with some sort of package of support. Is the message getting across?
No, if I'm being honest, no, it clearly isn't. That was really that's what prompted me to actually, send that letter in the first place. I don't think it's getting across. I think there is a sense that, oh, well, you're not urgent. You actually are largely funded by grants, and I'm sure they're okay anyway, aren't they? Which is why I'm putting emphasis on the longer term picture. I do think a large proportion of particularly smaller ones may be okay because they've got grant funding and so on. It is going to be this longer term picture that I think is really going to be challenging for them. I do think there's a responsibility for the sector to join hands to help each other, actually. And I think organisations like yours, Shaun, and others have done a really great job at really, encouraging the sector to work together. And I think, even the work that we've done on the environment plan, so really good examples of that. So we have a responsibility ourselves to step up, but I don't think we're going to be in the shape we need to be if government don't give us some element of support going forward. So no, the message isn't out there, Shaun, and I think we need to work hard to get our voices heard.
Well, thanks, Hilary, and certainly Green UK will carry on working on that, as will Wildlife and Countryside Link, and we've worked really closely together on this, and it's such an important issue for the movement. But if I can move on to Beccy now, Beccy, it's clear that in the last 6 weeks of lockdown, many people have taken solace from nature, but many people have also felt very deprived of nature during the lockdown, and there's a sense that we should value nature more once we get back to our normal lives. And I'm hearing a lot in my sort of bubble about how wonderful it is to hear bird song and smell clean air and so on. I wonder how hopeful you are that as it were, it's the bird song that's going to win rather than people's desire to get back in their cars and on their favourite planes when this is all over. Are we going to see a sort of greener future or business as usual?
Well, I think, birdsong's definitely been a huge solace. So, things like our breakfast bird watch of the RSPB, the self-isolating bird club, Vitamin N, they've all kind of provoked huge interest on social media. And it seems to be a real interest in people's immediate nature. So it's birds, but it's also plants, it's trees, it's the animals coming into your garden if you're lucky enough to have one. But, we need to be realistic about this. Social media feeds are also full of kind of shot swans, destroyed rookeries, HS2 going ahead, fly tipping, more burning. So, we're not in kind of Fotherington Thomas land where everybody's saying hello sky, hello trees, and the world's wonderful. Deforestation in the Amazon has increased by more than 50% compared with this time last year. So, not all is good in the world of nature. And it's a real issue about equal access, as you say. So about 2 million homes in the UK don't have a garden. And the most affluent 20% of wards have 5 times the amount of parks and green space access per person than the most deprived 10% of wards. So there's a broader levelling up agenda, which the government talks about a lot, particularly around health and well-being. But the great thing about birds is that they do take you from the intimate, the kind of wren you're hearing outside your bedroom window in the dawn chorus, through to the epic. So some of those birds will have journeyed 6,000 miles and been shot at and netted, and probably in the case of cuckoos, won't have made it across the Sahara because climate change means their food supplies are disappearing. It connects you from the domestic right through to the global, and it connects you from the emotional right through to science. And we're going to need all those lenses, I think, if the birds are going to win. So which will win? Well, definitely in an unfrozen moment. You know, in recent surveys, 54% of people have said they want change in their own lives, and less than 9% want to go back to the old normal. And people like Dominic Raab and Alok Sharma, the World Health Organization, have all been saying good stuff recently. And the Dasgupta review, I think, is a real sign of hope. You know, commissioned by the Treasury, it's an independent review on the economics of biodiversity. And it seems like it's a moment when we could move from biodiversity being the or to being the and in terms of economic recovery. We don't have to choose between one or the other. So what will help the birds win? Okay, so I think at the individual level, it's about active citizenship and whether we can use this connection to nature to create a more active citizenship around it. And I think creating the doorway for people to move from that situation of emotional connection and solace through to the wider issues around climate change and biodiversity loss is the key, and NGOs have a key role to play in that. And I think to do that, we need to stop intellectualizing and creating a climate of fear around climate change. We need to create a situation of a hopeful future and a better normal. So I think there's a real role there. I think in terms of the UK, I think cities are key and are already starting to reinvent themselves on the back of the virus, and I think that's really exciting. And a lot of the policy thinking that's already underway just needs to move harder and faster. So things like the Glover Review around national parks, big ideas like the Natural Recovery Network and the Biodiversity Net Gain concept, the Environment Bill, the Agriculture Bill, public money for public goods. A lot of that thinking is all in place, and we just need to push it harder and faster now and make sure that there's real strength in those bills. But moving on from the kind of UK situation to the global situation, then I think we need to think about our role in UK overseas territories, where there's about 94% of unique wildlife that belongs to the UK is in those overseas territories. We need to invest in those properly to make the difference that we need to make. You know, places like the Caribbean are right on the front line in terms of climate change. And then I think we need to think about our own footprint. So, you know, the 2015 Risky Business report that we did with WWF, you know, talked about our footprint through 7 key commodities that we're importing: soy, palm oil, cocoa, rubber, timber, pulp and paper, beef and leather. And I'm sure that UK consumption is going up at the moment, and we're going to do a revision of that report that's due to come out this year, and I'm sure we're going to see a footprint that's gone up in the sense of the impact we're having. So we really need to think about that direct line of sight from what we are consuming here in the UK through to species at risk and deforestation and industrial agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions. And until we do that and put in place trading standards and the kind of legislation we need to control that, really we're not making a huge amount of difference. And then we've got the leadership opportunity around CBD and around COP26 to really push for natural climate solutions on a big scale and a new deal for nature. So that leadership opportunity is huge for us as well. What are the risks then? So the risks are this push for deregulation, a real drive for deregulation, the major infrastructure development that Hilary talked about. And I think there's a risk around a green recovery being seen as a technological only approach to climate. So, you know, biodiversity gets knocked to one side by a kind of a rush for carbon, really. So I think those are the big risks that we've got to think about. But I do think that the situation around the pandemic has helped with this. So I think it's clear that if you want to avoid the kind of health risks we've had that have created this kind of pandemic, then biodiversity is absolutely key to that future for all of us. So my conclusion is, if we can move from a situation where we're talking about resource use all the time to one where we're talking about resource stewardship, if we can move from a more linear to a more circular economy, then we really are in a place where we can win ourselves, but the birds can win too. And you know, and we're also in a place where kind of listening to that wren in the dawn chorus and taking solace from it is absolutely connected to our future in terms of both the UK and the global economy as well.
Thanks, Beccy. That's a really challenging menu of things. I just wonder, what's the balance there between, as it were, individual action, what we can do as individuals, and this kind of huge picture which takes in kind of all aspects of domestic and international policy? Is there, maybe it's a false question, but do your however many members it is, 1.3 million, do they have to kind of think about this politically, or is it enough for them to put out bird feeders and try and be good citizens?
Yeah, I think it's really clear that it's not enough just to think about it and kind of, you know, feed the birds and to kind of, you know, do it because the nice robin reminds you of your granny. We want somebody who's gardening where the robin reminds them of their granny to also be using peat-free compost because they know that's what they should be using in their gardening for the same kind of reasons. So I don't think it's going to be enough for individuals to make the shift. We're going to need to make the shift on a policy level nationally and internationally as well. But I do think that policy does follow people to a certain extent. So if we can push people further and help them see that bigger picture, then that helps the policy agenda too.
Great, thanks, Beccy. So if I can turn now to Tony. Tony, over the last decade, environmental policies obviously very strongly been focused on climate rather than nature, but that does appear to be changing. And you've spoken eloquently about how you can't solve the climate crisis without solving the nature crisis, or the other way around, that the two are totally interdependent. I wonder if you worry that as we recover from COVID-19, nature will be left behind again because it just seems a little bit less politically salient, a little harder to measure than climate change, or whether we can continue to think in terms of the twin crisis.
Thank you, Shaun. Good afternoon, everybody. Shaun, in answering that question, I just open with a thought about the difference, the qualitative difference between these two sets of issues, climate on the one hand and nature on the other. And one thing I would immediately put my finger on is the extent to which climate change has been seen from the very beginning as being about people. It's about threats and risks to people. It's about flooding, it's about fires, it's about drought, it's about heat stroke, it's about death and destruction. And that narrative very quickly attracted in to the environmental camp a lot of fellow travellers from the poverty and justice worlds in particular, thereby creating a much bigger political constituency and a much bigger reach for the subject compared with the nature agenda, which had, until quite recently, that was seen to be about wildlife, not about people. And to that extent was seen as something which was of special interest to a group of people who like birds and moths and trees and butterflies. And so the two were quite different. And then the climate agenda then attracted the interests of economists, and the Stern Review being quite a major point of departure into a whole new narrative around climate change. And then when it reached that point, then it attracted the political leadership. And so from 2004, you had the Prime Minister of Britain talking about climate change being his top priority for the G7 summit and the European Union presidency we had that year, which then took it from being an environmental issue to being a political issue, which then stuck it on the front pages. And we've not really looked back since then. And so, you know, climate change was seen about people, it was seen about risk, and it was seen about economic cost, whereas nature was seen about wildlife, about ethics and aesthetics, and something which only a small group of people cared about. Now, that's beginning to change for very good reasons that we mostly can point to. And actually, what's going on right now, and Hilary and Beccy talked about this, you know, this reconnection with nature that people are experiencing, it has spilled out into the social media, it's spilled out into some of the political discussion about reopening green spaces, and will undoubtedly lay the foundations for a rich discussion post-COVID about how we can really reap those well-being benefits. Ideas like greening the green belt people are talking about, which is a great idea, rewilding around the edges of towns and cities to be able to create more opportunities for people to enjoy those benefits. And of course, at the same time, is unearthing a narrative about inequality. I'm sitting at the bottom of a beautiful garden I consider myself extremely fortunate and recognise that an awful lot of people don't have that. And that is coming through into the discussion as well. So that's going to have quite a profound impact on the post-COVID political discussion about nature. But that is not going to be enough. And what we have to do at the same time as those well-being benefits are being appreciated and hopefully reflected in policy, we must remind everybody that there's a much bigger economic story here too, because the big threat to nature is going to be that it gets sidelined in favour of economic growth and, you know, the familiar story that we saw after the financial crisis. So we've got to tell that carbon and nature story. We've got to tell that water security story, the food security story about the benefits of tourism, resilience in the face of climate change in terms of flood risk reduction. And all of that stuff is very well laid out. The work of the Natural Capital Committee and many others has actually captured that as a pretty strong economic narrative. So along the side, the well-being, we have to put that into the discussion so that we can get the attention of the economists, including in the Treasury. And happily, and I think Becky mentioned that Das Gupta review is a very important part of that. And actually, just looking at that Das Gupta review today, I note in the introduction a very interesting thing there that does actually start to draw a parallel with climate change insofar as nature destruction being a risk to the economy, like climate change is a risk to the economy. And the connection they've made, of course, is the pandemic, because the pandemic is an environmental issue. It is well-researched fact that the destruction of the natural environment, deforestation, the bushmeat trade, and the wildlife trade, legal or illegal, these are all sources of disease risks spilling out of nature and into the human world. And we've got plenty of experiences of that. HIV, SARS, a thing called Nipah virus, which came from bats. And having that as part of the post-COVID narrative about future risk management, I think will start to help to put nature in a similar standing to climate change in terms of how the politicians and the rest of society think about it. Because we've got to move it from that specialist thing that bird people care about into a mainstream thing, which is about the well-being of society and the future of the economy. And I think that is beginning to come. And so I think that is a bit of the narrative as we go forward. And just, you know, just to reflect on some of the parallels with the past, just by way of closing remarks, you know, the existing nature conservation regime we have in this country at the moment, it was born during the crisis of the Second World War, which, you know, even what we're going through now, that was considerably worse than this. But even in that terrible time, people were thinking about the better future that we could build beyond. And so that was where the national parks and the sites of special scientific interest and the Nature Conservancy and all that was actually being thought about. And it wasn't even a post-war thing. People were writing that stuff down during 1942 and 1943. And so I think it's incumbent on us as an environmental community to now be writing the vision for what comes after this. And I think I would characterize it as the spearhead being about well-being and beauty and the benefits we can all get from the natural environment, but very strongly backed up with an economics and risk narrative. And I think if we can do that and present this to decision makers and influencers as part of the post-COVID plan, I think we might get somewhere, because the world is certainly ready for change. And some of the reasons for that have become apparent over the last 2 months.
Great, thanks, Tony. And can I just follow up? You're now sort of in government, or at least chairing Natural England. Rather different position from being chief executive of Friends of the Earth. When you talk to people in government, do you think they understand? Are they moved by the narrative, or do they need something equivalent to the kind of parts per million you got in climate change and the very specific reports from the CCC and the IPCC and so on? It's a wider agenda, isn't it?
It is, and the answer is, of course, it's like everything. Some of them get it, and some of them really get it, and some of them still need some persuading. But inevitably, and this is a really interesting observation actually about the parts per million and the data, because even when you have the most morally driven objective of policy, you still need science and data to be able to work out what to do. And actually, the COVID thing actually is a good example of that, because, you know, the moral imperative is to save lives, but much of the discussion is about data and, you know, being able to analyse information to come to the right conclusion. And I don't think it will be any different with nature recovery post the pandemic. And hopefully we do manage to make an argument that works at multiple levels. It works at the level of moral purpose, of practical benefit, including human health and well-being. It works at the level of economic recovery, and it works at the level of future risk management. And if we can line up all of those arguments, then they will be all the more powerful if they are both expressed in terms of data explaining the problem and then also data explaining the solution. So it's not either or, it's always both and. But I would say, you know, if I could put my finger on the one thing we really need to nail over these coming months, it's going to be the economic case. And it's really quite timely that that Dasgupta interim report has just been published, setting out some very strong and clear views from the heart of Treasury as to how nature is actually vital for the economy. And I mean, it's like, it's not that difficult to work it out at a very high level. If you know, if there's no planet, there's no nothing. And so, you know, it's kind of a simple leap of logic. But having that set out in the language of economists, I think, does give us potentially quite a fertile bed in which to plant some seeds of thinking that will turn into policy.
Great, thanks, Tony. And another plug for the Green Lions website. There will be a blog, I think, tomorrow from Fiona Reynolds, Green Lions chair, on the Dasgupta review. So look out for that. So if I can pass now to Ruth. Ruth, you've got, I think, almost 500 participants on the call. Lots and lots of questions coming in. What should we start with?
Thanks, Shaun. Well, it's a challenge because there's lots of questions come in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. I'm going to start with one that came in beforehand, and it's something that many of the speakers touched on, and it's about equality. So we know that there are huge inequalities across the UK. I think, Becky, you talked about, you know, the few of us who are lucky enough to have gardens is one way that we can experience nature during lockdown. The question is, how can we work towards making nature accessible for all?
Thanks. Hilary, I'm going to ask you to kick off with that, because you've done National Trust done a lot, including on local parks in this area.
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. This has, you know, we've known that there's been inequality to green space for a very long time, but for sure COVID has put a spotlight on it. The Trust, you know, we did announce in January that we were particularly interested in finding ways that people in urban areas could find access to, as Becky said, green space on, you know, within a mile, but more importantly that they would create corridors out into the wilder areas. And there was, for me, there was a real connection between local nature through to engaging with our farming community, to engaging with our A&Bs and right out to our national parks. And this was an opportunity for the sector again to really join hands in how we would actually do that. But inequality has been, I don't know, there's another dimension to this, which is that sort of understanding of not just I can enjoy it, I need it to walk and just to, you know, to feel better for myself, but where is the connection between why this makes for a healthier environment in the round? I mean, we've heard endlessly that people are noticing that the sky is bluer, but they're not necessarily making the connection as to why that is. So there's something, I think, for us to think about in terms of education, and I use that word advisedly, but just helping engage in the wider dimension of why these things matter to anybody. And Becky has said, the connection between the wren singing and what that then means for everything else. It's really difficult though, because these concepts are quite complex. So in some way for me, and I guess it's what the Trust tries to do best, is unless you get people to get their hands on and engaged in some shape or form in nature, it's really hard to make that intellectual connection. So I think there has to be more done to enable people from all backgrounds, regardless to where they come from, what, you know, whether they live in a town or whether they live in the country, that they have some opportunity to engage with nature at some level, and that means a hands-on activity. And this, just to pick up on some of the things that the others have said, this connection, the economic dimension, will only make sense to people in government if they can see that tripartite thing, which is about health, which is about economy, and which is about civil society. And those three things need to pull together, and we can only play one part in that, but we need to work with other partners, maybe on likely and potentially sometimes difficult partners. We need to make those connections as a sector as well. but that inequality actually applies to all of those sectors. So, you know, whether, and I know there's some people on the call today, whether that's in the retail trade, for example, what part are they playing to enable people to engage with nature? What part is the hospitality sector playing in doing that? So we as a sector need to engage with others to try to address that inequality.
Thanks, Hilary. Beccy, nature can be accessible to everybody, but not necessarily accessed by everybody or understood by everybody. And a lot of people have said that the conservation movement is very white and rather old. What can we do about that?
Yeah, fair cop. I think we need to change that. I think there's a number of things. So one is I think the concept of the Nature Recovery Network actually linked with what I hope will be a real sense of community cohesion and empowerment, which I sense is coming out of this crisis. Those two things together, I think, could be really powerful in helping deliver some of what Hilary talked about, which is, you know, really giving that equal access. But I think as a movement, as a conservation movement, we have, not deliberately, but we have been viewed probably as elitist, as behind, you know, closed doors sometimes, worried about precious spaces and so on. And I think there's a real shift now in terms of getting beyond those boundaries. And I think, you know, I mean, we're working, for example, with Barratt's, who are a mass house builder, looking at how we can kind of create accessible green space with housing developments. So I think we've got to kind of realise that whilst we've got to worry about individual species and looking after species that are a threat, we can also move very much into the area where we're looking at green space for everyone. But it's going to mean a real shift in the movement, and that will take some time. But I think we've got to genuinely step up and focus on that, because I think without that we won't take the mass of people with us, and therefore we won't get the world that we want.
Great, thanks, Beccy. And Tony, many major conurbations across the UK now surrounded by green belts. You talked about greening the green belt. How can we make the green belt more of a resource for people in towns to help them get out into the country, rather than just a sort of buffer against development?
Yeah, so this is going to require some joined up thinking and some vision from planning authorities. So, you know, I don't want to be too gloomy about the state of the greenbelt, but around many of our towns and cities, you know, it's got burnt out cars, a few donkeys grazing scrubby fields that aren't very good for anything, not even donkeys. And, you know, we can do much better with these places, I would say. And we have a whole range of new tools coming through in terms of the new environmental land management scheme, which hopefully could be influencing farmers in some of those landscapes. We have the government's tree planting targets, which I prefer to call woodland establishment ambitions or woodland recreation ambitions. And we have the net gain tool that will be coming through in the Environment Bill, plus a really huge amount of positive energy behind the ideas in rewilding different landscapes. If we could target some of that into the areas around our towns and cities, and then be thinking about active transport to those by walking and cycling routes, we could potentially be opening up areas of high quality wildlife habitat that would also be catching carbon, would also be helping the rivers to run more cleanly, might be helping to reduce flood risk, could be places where we could reintroduce charismatic animals. These could be really incredibly important resources. Now, I would say that we need to not detract from the old conservation agenda as we do this, because if we target the activity there, some of the key sites that are further away from the towns and cities, maybe we could foresee a risk of those being neglected, and we wouldn't want to do that. But a multi-purpose nature recovery network certainly is at the heart of what we're thinking at Natural England now as the big ambition for the future. And that nature recovery network would include recovery of nature in those peri-urban areas, and indeed in the cities too, inside the towns and cities along rivers and in existing parklands, for example, to bring wildlife into those places in a better way. And if we can have that collective joint vision of that multi-purpose nature recovery network delivering economic benefits, including in the form of health and well-being, I think that could be the big idea that we might want to look for after this is all over. And, you know, that nature recovery network being the place where people can get health and well-being, not only through the kinds of things that we would all do as naturalists and environmentalists, but also be the kinds of places that would be useful for social prescribing. And this is a conversation we've been having with Public Health England. And even at this difficult time, it seems that the interest there in that kind of approach to the future, linking up the health and environmental agendas in a more formal way, undiminished enthusiasm for that there. So if we can build support for that kind of big idea for a nature recovery network and get other bits of government crucially involved apart from the Department for the Environment, then I think we can make some progress.
Great, thanks, Tony. Very, very clever of you also to get a birdsong accompaniment in the background.
Yes, and that's not a recording; that's a real one.
Kate Jennings from RSPB is asking, is it a blackbird? It seems.
Oh, it certainly is. We've got blackbird, we've got blackcap, we've got dunnock, we have all sorts of things.
Well, thanks, Tony. I will resist the temptation to defend the current state of the Greenbelt and go on to Ruth for more questions.
Thanks, Shaun. So following hotly on Tony's heels there about social prescribing, something that's proved to be a very popular question in the Q&A box from today's attendees is about exactly what you were talking about, Tony, and how can we embed nature within the health system as part of our response to the pandemic. You started talking about some of the ways in which that might be done, but it would be good to hear some other ideas on that.
So who wants to kick off with this? So Beccy, have you done stuff actually specifically on kind of social nature prescribing and so on?
Yeah, we've done a bit. So we did some up in Shetland, of all places, actually, which was enormously successful. And we're now looking at rolling that out further in Scotland. And I think it is a concept whose time has come, really. The big issue we find, it's a bit like working in schools, where you have a knowledgeable and enthusiastic teacher, you know, who can kind of drive that forward with you, then it all works much better. So I think there's something about us reaching out much more to the medical profession to really try and equip them with a bit of confidence and knowledge around this, because in terms of the benefits that it delivers, I mean, those are absolutely to be seen now, and you know, there's a lot of data to back it up, and it just makes an enormous difference in terms of a community's health and well-being if they've got access to this kind of prescription. So I think there's something for us as the NGOs, I think, to really reach out to the medical profession on the back of this, and to the kind of the social structures around that, in order to really equip people with that confidence.
Thanks. I mean, Hilary, Tony, have you got anything to say? Chip in. Otherwise, I'm happy to go for more questions.
Yeah, well, only to say, Shaun, yeah, the Trust has been doing quite a bit of social prescribing actually right around the country at different levels. You know, in some respects, we're getting very specific financial support to deliver very formal programs around social prescribing. So, you know, we're going as far as having people dedicated to doing that at certain sites. In other cases, we are simply making our sites available for others to come and use them for this kind of activity. I think what we're more interested in actually is, as an organisation, starting to really think about how we can work with different groups so that we are as accessible and as useful to groups, particularly with different types of illnesses. For example, we have gone into a formal partnership with the Alzheimer's Society this year, really looking to see how we can work with people who come to us with that particular condition. We're also working with Mind, we're starting to work with other disability groups. So while it's not quite the same as social prescribing, what we're absolutely doing is making the connection between access to green space and to beauty, actually, more generally, and how that can be restorative. But I think it has to go beyond just making it available. There's a lot more for organisations like us to do, to think to another level about what do you really need to do to make these environments work for people who have particular health issues. And that does take you into, you know, challenging areas, because it may not be quite central to your charitable purpose, as it is for the Trust. It's about bringing benefit to the nation, and I think it sits very squarely with what we're about. But it can be quite a challenging thing for some other organisations. So I think I don't think it's something everybody needs to feel as if they jump into, but but it certainly is an area that will grow. I have no doubt that it's one of the things that is going to come out of COVID, and certainly will be taken forward in a more sort of thoughtful way.
Thanks, Hilary. Tony.
So yeah, just a brief thought on all this stuff, Shaun. So you know, this health and well-being dimension of access to nature, it's been around, you know, with an increasing body of science behind it for years. But I think as a sector, the environmental community, we haven't really made the most of that evidence yet in order to be able to pull together some collaboration between the Department for Health and other bits of government in a way which is very strategic. Actually, I just got this off the shelf. I just reminded myself a moment ago that when this was written 5 years ago, I put a piece in here about the case for diverting 1% of the National Health Service budget for nature recovery because of the value we'd get back in terms of avoided costs in relation to various chronic illnesses, including depression and anxiety and these kinds of things. And I just wonder whether now the time will be right for there to be a much stronger case to be put by the conservation community. I mean, I couldn't possibly say things like that now. I'm the chair of Natural England, but it's too late. I said it 5 years ago. And for that to be now, you know, brought more fully into the conversation, especially when, you know, it's no longer data. It goes back to what you were saying a moment ago. You know, do we need the information and the parts per million kind of information, as well as the kind of, you know, the broad support and insight? And I think, you know, this is one of those moments where those two things will come together, because there is a huge body of academic research, and it will be the case that we will all know after this how good nature is for our health and well-being. And then that tends to be the kind of moment when you can get progress. And so I think if there's one thing that, and we've all talked about it in different ways already, it's that health and well-being piece. Especially since, you know, we've got a good body of evidence to show as well how it's people with the worst social deprivation indicators who benefit most from access to the natural environment. And, you know, we're all going to be thinking, you know, about how we can heal some of the inequalities that are becoming so vivid during the course of all of this. And so there's a strong narrative there with a social dimension, a health dimension, and, you know, it links up with that greening the green belt idea as well. I think there's some really fertile territory here for us if we can think it through correctly, and the more obviously we can come with a common set of views, the better.
Thanks, Tony. And for those listening on the podcast, Tony was waving a copy of his best-selling book, What Nature Does for Britain, available in all good bookshops when they reopen. Andrew Ledwood from DEFRA gave a plug for the Social Prescribing Academy on the chat as well. Ruth, more questions.
Thanks, Shaun. So again, something that's been a common theme from the panelists and the questions is people's newfound connection with nature. We know, especially from those organisations working on urban fringes, people's interest in getting out into the countryside has never been greater. How do we harness that newfound connection with nature and local green spaces to secure nature's recovery?
So, perhaps Hilary, you could address that, but actually also just perhaps question the premise that people really have reconnected with nature. Do we know this? What's the evidence?
I think it's fair. We haven't got the evidence right now, Shaun, but just picking up what Tony has said there, virtually every environmental charity that I'm working with at the moment have done their own little bit of research to say nature matters, you know, or to prove nature matters. Certainly the National Trust did a fairly extensive piece of research with a number of universities this year to prove just that. So I think there has been retrospective data to prove this, but what we have at the moment is a sense of something that really matters. And you know what, that momentum matters more at this moment in time than all the data that you could throw at it. There is a sense that green space has been important, that people have wanted to get outdoors. And that's the momentum that we as a sector must jump on. There is not going to be a better time for us to be able to get on the back of a wave of something that's really quite powerful at the moment, I would say. And one of the very almost simple ways of us being able to do that has to be through volunteering. Now, clearly the call to help the health sector has been loud and rightly responded to in the nation, but that has also awoken a sense of, I can do something, I can personally play a part here. And the next opportunity will be will be our environment. So you've got momentum behind people interested in it, and you've got momentum behind people thinking, actually, I can physically, personally contribute in some way. Now is the time for us to really capitalize on that. And, you know, all of us, every one of us should be looking at ways to engage, you know, different people in volunteering into the environmental sector. You know, all ages from all different backgrounds. Now is the moment. So I know certainly we as an organisation are looking at that. We do know that volunteering is likely to change quite dramatically over the next number of decades. Age profiles, all sorts of things will impact on that. But now is definitely a time for us to make, you know, to jump on the back of that momentum.
Thanks. And so we can get more questions in, I'm just going to ask Ruth for another one, and Beccy, you can weave your answer to that one into the next one. Ruth, more questions.
Does the panel think the government remains as committed to a greener future as it was?
Perhaps it's unfair to ask Tony that question as from Natural England. I'm going to ask Beccy.
I think the jury's out. So I think there was a sense in which there was definitely a momentum building. I think across, you know, the Environment Bill, the Agriculture Bill, the sense in which we could step into the leadership space around some of the global meetings happening, and I think you know, we are hearing some good words around wanting to push through into a green recovery. But I think there are strong voices who will be calling for that deregulatory agenda, that kind of, you know, let's build our way out of this crisis agenda. And so I think the government has some big choices to make, and has some quite tempting choices probably at the moment to make. So the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. Will it push through those bills as they stand and strengthen them, because they do need strengthening? Will it absolutely step into that leadership space around a new deal for nature through the CBD, and then, you know, pushing biodiversity as part of the COP26 solutions? And I kind of I want to have kind of faith that this is going to happen, and I'm certainly seeing some good things and hearing some good things. But I think everyone here probably who's got an interest and is on this call today, we absolutely have to put our shoulder to the wheel, and we have to be united in doing that, because this is a moment of jeopardy as well as a moment of choice. And we have, you know, this is the unfrozen moment. It's not going to come along again in this shape or form for a long time, and we've absolutely, you know, this is the urgency now means we have to make this count. So, you know, I think the opportunity is there, but it's going to take a lot more effort just to push it through and push it over the line.
Great, thanks, Beccy. I'm going to ask Ruth one or two more questions, and then we'll ask the panelists to sum up. And Ruth.
So just building on what you said, Beccy, I mean, you know, the government's plans to deliver nature's recovery include the legislation that you talked about, leadership and investment as well. What do you think should be top of the government's to-do list?
Tony, are you able to take this question as an individual? You're on mute.
I'm unmuted now. Someone's unmuted me. So what should be the top priority, Ruth, was the point, was it? The question there? Well, I kind of said some of this a little bit earlier, but I kind of just put it slightly differently. So, you know, we've got a 25-year environment plan. We've got great ambition. We've got big global challenges running in parallel. And, you know, we've got a reasonable start made on some of our thinking around climate change. The bit which is slightly lagging behind, according to, you know, the state of nature reports, amongst other things, is the nature piece. And so we really do now have to see, I think, some real practical steps forward on nature recovery in the country. And the thing that is sitting at the heart of all of the different policy tools and papers and legislation and ideas that are coming forward is this idea of an ambitious nature recovery network for the country. And to be able to combine some kind of national mapping exercise with bottom-up partnerships, including greening the green belt, including in restoring coastal areas, including in bringing back missing species, including in restoring habitats that have declined too far, and doing that as part of a program of seeking to reap multiple benefits from nature's recovery. And, you know, we've talked a lot about that already in terms of public health and well-being, but also carbon capture, also water security, also resilience to climate change. And I think for me, and at Natural England, we're saying this very openly, you know, that is the big idea, where we can pull together not only all of the different benefits and all of the different tools, but all of the different organisations and actors that can deliver that, from farmers to landowners to the organisations on the call today, the rest of the conservation community, private sector companies, local authorities. If we can create that backbone of a nature recovery network, then all of these things can then be slotted in a strategic and crucially a financially efficient way. Because if you've got one budget trying to do one thing in the landscape, and then a different budget trying to do something else, then you've got problems. And that's what we've got right now. We've got some of the ways in which we've been supporting agriculture over the decades. You know, we've caused problems that we're then having to clean up with the flood budget and, you know, removing pollution from raw water before it can be supplied to the public. So this is not just an ambition about nature and about those benefits. It's also an ambition that could make this job so much more efficient if we come forward with a clear idea of what that nature recovery network looks like, and then we can begin to populate its implementation through all the different organisations and budgets that are there. And actually, Dieter Helmer's made this point very effectively about the budgets. He mapped the Thames Basin and found multiple budgets being spent by multiple different official bodies, often being spent in opposition to one another. I mean, this is madness. The Nature Recovery Network could help to solve that problem too, I would argue.
Great, thank you, Tony. Well, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, so I'm going to go to the panelists for closing remarks now, and start with Hilary. And I'm going to ask all the panelists one of the questions that came in, which is, when lockdown ends, which special place do you want to be visiting first? But also, I just would like you all just to reflect on sort of any real take-home messages, and, you know, in particular, if you were if the Prime Minister or the First Minister or the Chancellor was listening to this, what one thing would you say to them to convince them of the importance of this agenda? Or what one place would you take them to?
Oh, God, it's really hard. The National Trust has so many amazing places, and there's so many amazing places across the whole of the country. Where would I want to be? Do you know what? This is going to sound really daft, but I actually would quite like to get back to Swindon, which is our headquarters. It's a really not a very nice place in many respects, but you know what? I'm desperate to get back into the thick of the organisation to really try to get us moving again. I feel, and my message to government would: this is a moment of renewal. It's a moment to start again, and I want to be able to get back into my organisation and start. And look at this, what's going to be a completely different economic landscape and a different social landscape, and how does the National Trust respond and rise to that challenge? And that's what the government needs to do. It needs to think about those two things and think about them differently, and not revert to their old way of going straight to we need to build more roads to get ourselves out of this. And you need to look at both the social impacts and the economic impact, and here we have an opportunity to bring nature front and centre into that renewal. And so now is the time for them to be thinking ahead, not dealing with the problem that they have right in front of them. I'm talking about once we get out of this post-COVID situation. And so now is the time for them to think green, and not to be, I think there has to be a win-win situation here for the economy and for people and for nature. It has to be for all three, otherwise future generations won't thank us for it. But yeah, I can't quite believe I'm saying I want to get back to Swindon, but I actually do. That seems weird. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilary. We've had a message of thanks from the Swindon Tourist Agency, who's going to quote you on the next brochure. Tony, and then I'll end with Beccy. Tony.
Sorry, here we go, unmuted. I agree with Hilary in many ways. In terms of the place I'd most like to be is back with our team and with our partners. Lucky enough to have quite a lot of green space here, and actually without breaking any rules, I'm able to go up to the back end of the Wicken Vision up near Wicken Fen and to walk along some footpaths there and to see things like cranes and bitterns. So I don't feel as though I'm being particularly deprived in that sense at the moment. But the thing I'm really missing is engaging with all of the people on the call today and who are there listening in, and to be able to be coming up with you know, those kinds of plans that we need to have for the future. And one thing I was really looking forward to in May was launching the Nature Recovery Partnership, actually, with Beccy and Hilary and others, to begin putting in place, you know, a more public expression of support for the Nature Recovery Network. And so hopefully we'll get back to that very soon, and to be able to work again with colleagues in the way that we all know works best, although, you know, we're doing not too bad with Zoom, are we? So that's really where I'm hoping to be. Just one thought, and I just saw something pop up on the chat here, just in terms of takeaway messages from this conversation today. I do think it's going to be absolutely essential for the environmental sector, if there is such a thing, to find a way of expressing a common voice over this coming period. You do great work on this, Shaun, at Green Alliance, and I just encourage you, with all the enthusiasm I can muster, just to seize this moment, because as Hilary just said, it's not going to come again, or for a bit anyway, and let's hope not, actually. But you know, if we're going to take the opportunity as well as the crisis, then we're going to need to get ourselves organised. And I say ourselves, you know, I'm a public servant, but, you know, I think the ambition is sufficiently clear in government now for me not to be overstepping any lines when I say, you know, there is a real sense of common endeavour, not only amongst NGO colleagues, but also from government agencies.
Thanks, Tony. I should say there's great energy also among the environmental groups that Green Alliance is working with, and the question is just to try and pull everything together and get a kind of common message, and also one where nature and climate are united, and that's what we're seeking to do. So if I can turn finally to Beccy, other than Swindon, where would you like to go for your well-being, and also what would you say to the Prime Minister or First Minister?
So you know, I'm just gonna speak from a purely personal context here. I would love to just get back to Lewis and Harris up in the Outer Hebrides, which is a long way from Swindon, but the kind of the experience that I can get there, which is of, you know, a really wild experience of those kind of incredible seabirds, just all kind of, you know, the speed of the gannets diving into the sea, and the sense you get of just a kind of a really sort of, you know, a whole world that's existing and ignoring humanity, actually, but of course we're having a massive impact on it. And so just kind of to feel that again, and to feel that sense of wildness, I really miss that. I'm loving my kind of domestic furlough and kind of seeing birds in my garden and really getting to know my patch, but just that sense of wildness would be brilliant from a personal context. I'm missing the sea. But I think, you know, and in terms of what I would, you know, really want government to do, I do think people explicitly, maybe implicitly, have realised through this crisis that there is stuff that really matters, and it's not necessarily the stuff that the world has been telling them matters for quite some time. And I just really would want government to recognise that sense of different values that is coming out of this crisis, and to reflect those new values that people have discovered in their policy making and in the kind of recovery that they shape for us, because I think that could take us a long way towards the kind of future that we've all been talking about, and I just think that could be so powerful. So I want government to listen to the people and to hear those values that have changed.
Well, thank you for that, and thanks to all our panelists. And this really does seem like a moment of opportunity, if also of peril. But let's emphasise the opportunity for now. I think we have all learned as individuals and hopefully as society in this sort of extraordinary period of lockdown. So let's try and ensure that some good comes of this terrible epidemic. So thank you, Hilary, Tony, and Beccy. Thanks to Ruth and Ollie for organising. I should thank the audience. We had a tremendous audience, between 400 and 500 people throughout. A really great amount of exchange on the chat and the Q&As. Sorry we didn't have time to take more questions, but thanks so much for tuning in. Do look out for further online events which we will be running. Look out for the podcast of this in a couple of days' time. Give us your feedback on what you think we at Green Alliance should be doing and can be doing to bring people together and to exchange ideas during this crisis and beyond. And have a very good evening, all of you. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Shaun.